Hello, friends. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time. If this is your first time joining us, there are two threads that have been tugging at me, or that I've been tugging at. Maybe we've been tugging at each other. And I'm genuinely unsure which one to start with. One has to do with spirituality, one has to do with storytelling. I think storytelling is where we're going to start. Ultimately, I'm trusting that we'll end up in the same place, whichever thread we start pulling on first. So way back in 2010, 2011, I had been doing a lot of performance storytelling at things like the Malt and various shows around Los Angeles, and I've been working for nonprofit organizations for a bunch of years. And I came up with this idea that I, at the time, and this is so ridiculous to say, especially given how much hype there is around storytelling right now, at the time, this seemed like the most revolutionary idea ever to teach storytelling workshops to nonprofit organizations because they were amazing people doing amazing things and were generally very terrible talking about what they do. So, not a communication strategy workshop, but literally just storytelling. And you know, it took some doing to convince people to bring this in. I did a lot of workshops for free at first. And then what I started to realize is that the part of these workshops that felt most energized and alive and generative wasn't the strategic part. That was there because people needed strategy. But in the introduction of story, or in the reintroduction of story to these organizations and teams and cohorts, simply as a joy in and of itself. That when we took out the element of how do we persuade people to give us money or do this thing or do X, and simply allowed people to sink into the truth of their lived experience and story and exchange that with each other, there was something so incredibly beautiful that emerged from that. Over the past few years, I've backed away from storytelling, not because I don't think it's important, but because I think it's man, we're losing the magic of it. We're losing the magic of it. Organizational storytelling has become its own field. And as I'm saying this, I'm feeling like a little bit of grief and heartbreak because in the overstructuring of story, in the emergence of things like Donald Miller's story brand framework, which is kind of marketing by another name, we're losing the essence of story, which is life, which is vitality, which is the magic of authorship of our own experience and trading that with others. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which if you haven't read it, highly recommend, um, Robin Kimmerer talks about how indigenous peoples used to come together and sit in circles and trade their different creation stories and cosmologies and myths, not to try to convince anyone of anything, but simply out of the pure joy of exchanging worldviews. And it just feels like we have gotten so far away from that. And so I've stepped away from storytelling because I don't want to fight over it. I don't want to fight over it. I want it to be joyful. I want to find that joy of looking across the table or across the circle or across the campfire, real or metaphorical, and sharing experience with each other. And then allowing that to shape into a narrative. Because then storytelling becomes a ritual, becomes a ceremony, becomes a way of interacting with and calling spirit. Most folks who I meet these days or interact with don't know that years ago I wrote and performed a solo show called Ceremony that was about a healing ceremony that I participated in, plant medicine, way back in 2012 in Peru. And in the construction of that story, what I had told my director, an amazing woman named Diana Wyan, was I don't want to act. I want this story to be as pure a transmission of the experience that I had in these ceremonies as possible, so that the story itself becomes a ceremony, so that the audience goes from being passive observers to feeling a sense of belonging in the circle of healing that emerged through the story. And I think a fair number of people who saw the show over the 3 years that I performed it all over the country experienced some version of that. I still get messages from time to time from people who experience the story, and it still resonates with them. And I'm experiencing I'm just feeling into a lot of heartbreak today around how we don't get to have that experience of story right now, because things are so excuse me, feels so fragmented, and there's no space for a circle of story where everybody's experience is heard and valued and lifted up. Certainly not in the public sphere. I ate cookies right before recording this, and I think they're getting caught in my throat. And so there's this idea of story as when it's done in a good way, in an aligned way, in a grounded way, being almost a kind of spell casting, an invocation of magic that comes when we're fully in an experience. And that is a type of spirituality. And I think that brings us nicely to the second thread that I've been pulling at, has been pulling at me. And it's a very specific memory of a few years ago in Los Angeles. So probably, honestly, 7 or 8 years ago, I had been invited to do a few workshops for some gatherings. I honestly don't remember what they are. And when the conveners, the people holding the gatherings, asked how they should introduce me, my default is generally just say, like, here's Michael Cass, he's going to do some stuff, and then I can do a thing. But they introduced me as a spiritual leader. One introduced me as a spiritual leader, and the other as a spiritual teacher. And like my whole being kind of like, not recoiled, but cringed a little bit at that. Even though at that point I'd been facilitating breath work and healing work and all sorts of stuff along those lines for 7 years. And I think part of it for me is that in the designation of spiritual leader for me, and I don't know that I'm not claiming this as objectively true, but in the story I hold, there is a siloing of that from the practical, from the mundane, from the strategic, right? And so at this conference opportunity collaboration I've gone to for the past few years, I last year pitched them a thing that I was calling an embodied leadership workshop, which was breath work and inner dance sound journey. And I think one of the people who was working with me on it said, like, oh yeah, we'll have these spiritual sessions that you do. And I again was like, they're not spiritual. They're not just spiritual. These are ways of being more present in our work and in our bodies. And I've been sitting with that this week, as again, as always, my work is always shifting, and I'm feeling myself more drawn into work that is connected with spirit. Earlier this week, I was on a call with some dear friends and colleagues, and we were talking, and at some point I said, we're all engaged in some way in social change or systemic change work, and at some point I said, you cannot have successful systemic change without spirit. Spirit is the missing piece in a lot of these places. And when we label something as spiritual or somebody as a spiritual leader, almost always or very frequently, there's a sense that, oh, they don't need to be in those systemic change conversations because they're doing something else. And to me, that's so insane. And I think that's why I cringed from that idea of spiritual leader. So I was thinking of this whole idea of spirit. And spirit in many languages and traditions is almost synonymous with breath, right? The meaning of spirit is intrinsically connected with breath, the force of life, the divine spark, any kind of non-physical energy. In Hebrew, right, the word ruach means breath, it means wind, and it means spirit. In Greek, the word pneuma means breath, wind, and spirit. And so when somebody says, oh, that's spiritual work, if we go back to some of the roots of the languages that many of us come from, another way of saying that is, oh, that's breath work. That's the work of breathing. And if it's the work of breathing, then it belongs in every single conversation we have about anything, whether it's systemic change, whether it's what to make for dinner. Those are spiritual conversations because we have to breathe them into being, into interaction. So there's something interesting in that. If we layer it on top of that exploration around story, because to tell a story, to share space with people in this, where we're creating a story world, is to trade breath. The stories are carried on currents of breath or currents of spirit across a circle or across an internet, across a whatever. And so story is also spiritual work. There's another piece of this that, for me, like, a spiritual leader in a village or in a community is somebody who intervenes with the more than human world or with spirit guides, right? Guardians, beings from other realms or dimensions, that intervenes with those beings on behalf of a community. To me, like, that is a spiritual leader. And at least at this point in my journey, what I do is I help people connect with breath. I help people connect with story. I help people reconnect with the currents of life that they are intrinsically connected to, even though we've been educated away from it. I don't know what to call that, but it's not a spiritual leader. Seeing if there's anything else that wants to be said on this. I think for me, that if I kind of close my eyes and feel into the energy of this field note, what stands out in big neon letters is change is not possible without spirit. Individual change, systemic change, governmental change, deep change, surface level cosmetic change. You don't need spirit. You don't even need breath for that, right? You just need an internet connection. But for change that is rooted and deep and lasting, whether it's in our individual lives and our stories, whether it's in our organizations or teams, whether it's in our systems and our governments, one of the reasons generative change has been so challenging in the modern world, like change, when I say generative change, in my mind, that's like change that is deeply allied with life, with flourishing for all beings. One of the reasons that's been so difficult is that we haven't allowed spirit to be in the conversation. We haven't breathed with it. We haven't allowed those spaces to breathe, at least not in my experience of them, not in a widespread way. So I think I'll leave us there. This has been unexpectedly emotional. The heartbreak of what I see happening with story, battles for perception, narrative battles. There is one more thing, as I'm saying this, that bubbles up. One is, I work a lot with this model that is kind of like a triangle or pyramid. At the top, the very top is action, the things that we do. Beneath that is story, holds our beliefs. Then what we sense in our body, vibrations. At the bottom, the like widest level, is energy. And in this model, there's two ways to facilitate change. Well, there's lots of ways. You can enter that pyramid or that triangle at any level. But you can work purely at an energetic level, and then the impact of that ripples upwards through vibration, body, story, and action. Or you can change the story, change the stories that you tell, change the stories that you take in. A few years ago, I set myself a challenge in the stories I consume that I love science fiction and fantasy. I don't remember if I've talked about that on here or not, but I love it. And the challenge I set myself is I would only read science fiction fantasy written by um, people identifying as women who are women of color, right? And so that's like Octavia Butler and Rebecca Roanhorse, N.K. Jemisin, like amazing authors. And because they're systems of magic, because they're systems of fantasy, we're going out on a skinny branch here together, friends, but because their systems of magic come from almost always non-Western contexts, it started to change the way that I thought about magic and spirit. Because even though they're amazing storytellers, really what these stories are doing is they're exploring different ways of working with energy, different ways of conceiving of and working with consciousness and myth and connection. And so when we start to change the stories that we take in, that we surround ourselves in, then it changes the boundaries of our imagination, which changes the way that we interact with that vast field of energy that's all around us. That's a lot of what the library methodology / process that I talked about the last episode is about. And when we start to work with story differently, now we're working with breath differently. We're working with that breath of life, that spirit differently. So that's my hope, that we can reclaim spirit and reintegrate it into our awareness of our breathing and our stories and our interactions, so that it's not, and now we'll do a 10-minute meditation. It's our meetings, our retreats, our spiritual gatherings, just as they are strategic gatherings, just as they are about change, because we can't have change without spirit. I'm going to take a breath just to close this one out. Maybe you'll join me. Thanks as always for listening. See you again soon.